English time. Come on, grab your pens. We're gonna read of very distant lands with Squints the brain and Lemon the teacher. The learning will never end. It's English time.
Hey guys. Alright, if you haven't started doing the reading, you might want to stop right now and go and read at least chapters 6 and 7. I'm going to be starting with chapter 8 today. Why? Because there's particular parts I want to get to, and I have a half hour to get there. Now, right now in the book as I'm reading this, and this is the first time I've reread this book since the current situation, I am very, very, very much reminded of the way that things first started. So with this, with COVID, so when we started off, like in the last chapter, you heard things and there was kind of like, well, what's going on? In chapter 4, we had that part where they're talking in the coffee shop and there's the rumors about whether or not it's caused by that coffee at the dock that's gone bad. And they say, no, that can't be it. And then they remember other times that were like this. And there's kind of all those rumors going around. And even though Polly dies at the end of chapter number 2, it's still becoming kind of real. It reminds me a little bit of right at the beginning of this. And when it was still becoming kind of a real thing, we weren't sure what to make of it. And so you're trying to do life the way that you normally would, but then you quickly find out that normal is not the way that we have. So this, so since we're doing that, we're going to, I want to start in chapter 8 with this. Chapter 7 was where Colette Ogilvy collapsed. So I'm assuming that you've read through chapters 6 and 7 because we're starting in 8. Okay, here we go. Chapter 8. I smelled the breath of death for the first time since all this hardship began and was scared. So this is from the diary of J. Henry C. Helmet, Philadelphia, 1793. So this is an actual entry from a person who went through this, a doctor. And we're going to be talking a lot about doctor things today. And we'll relate that to today's world. So, from the time that Colette Ogilvy collapsed, the church bells of Philadelphia tolled without cease. So, they have church bells. And they would ring the church bells each time. So here's a church. I don't know how to draw a church. And up here, you've got a bell. And they'd ring the church bells when somebody died. So that would be how you would know it. They didn't have Twitter. They didn't have the internet. This is one of the ways they communicate, was with bells. Guns were fired on the street corners and a cannon blast in the public square to purify the air. So they're trying to fix things. So one of the things that they would do would to try and clean the air, because they're not sure where it's coming from. They'd burn things. And the idea was that if you shot a cannon and that gunpowder went off, it would help kill whatever it was that was causing the disease. Not a whole lot unlike things that go out there right now with like the idea that you can buy an air purifier that will purify the air and you will be fine. There is some evidence that we've seen that COVID is a little susceptible to UV light, but nothing like that shows that throwing it through an air purifier will work. But people are trying things. On top of that, we suffered the constant buzz of mosquitoes, blowflies, and hornets. The din was maddening. Which is kind of the opposite. It's been so quiet with us, but for them, at this point, it was really, really loud. The day after our ill-fated tea party, Mother sent a note to the Ogilvys, inquiring about Colette's health, but received no response. They had disappeared. She also sent a note to the Luddingtons. No word from them either, thank heavens. Many of the wealthy families were fleeing. We were lucky to get 4 or 5 customers a day, which, once again, we can relate to that. Think of restaurants right now and the things that are changing. And there were also reports of people who, richer people who were fleeing to, like, I remember there's this guy that I read a report of, and he's a rich guy, and he has his own private island. He's just hanging out on his own private island. A violent thunderstorm on Sunday cleared the air for a few hours, but when the sun came out Monday, it baked the streets until the rainwater rose in ghostly plumes of steam. Excellent description right there. I felt like a noodle overboiled in the stew pot, and the bells continued to toll. I'm going to climb the church tower and cut the tongues out of those bells myself, Eliza grumbled as she beat a dozen eggs. Hand me the nutmeg, child. Nutmeg and eggs. I passed her the small grater. Don't you have something to do? She asked. It's hot enough here without an extra body breathing on me. What did your mother say before she left? I'm waiting for grandfather to finish his business in the necessary. The bathroom. He said I could go with him to the newspaper office. Eliza scowled and waved a towel at the flies buzzing above the bowl. Pick me some fresh asparagus grass. These pests are a plague. The bright sun blinded me as I stepped outdoors. The garden looked distressingly poor. Even with all the watering I had done and the brief rain, it was a good thing we were able to buy at the market. Foreshadowing. The asparagus grass grew along the back fence. I gathered a handful of fronds, cut them at the base, and tied the bunch together with a piece of twine. Back in the kitchen, I stood on a chair and hung them from an iron hook in the center ceiling beam. There, I said, pushing the chair back against the wall. That should discourage the flies. Thank you. Taste this pudding and tell me if it's all right. I chewed and pondered. It needs more sugar. You think everything needs more sugar. Eliza wiped the sweat off her face with a handkerchief. I think that tea with the Ogilvy sisters affected you. Maybe you would be right. Maybe you would be right for their Edward. Remember that they were trying to figure out if she should marry this Edward guy. But remember, she likes Nathaniel. And relationships. Whoa, my mic just about fell off. Sorry. She stirred the fire and lay on more wood. It wasn't that long ago folks didn't have any sugar. No coffee or tea either. Please, Eliza, not another history lesson. I'll scream. Eliza humped and set pudding over the fire. Don't know which is worse, you mourning or your mother staring out the window, hoping someone will walk in and lay a shilling on the table. We have ugly days ahead of us. No sugar for anyone, rich or poor. No one. No. I fanned myself with the wooden spoon. Grandfather says this trouble will soon be over. He says people don't have gumption anymore. Now, this is an interesting thing. I also notice this a lot. We have a tendency when we get older to be like, in my day, we were better at stuff and tougher. And I think that is kind of just a thing that happened. My parents had a different perspective on this thing than I did, and I had a different perspective a little bit than you guys. And I've definitely heard a thing that sounds like that. Eliza mumbled something under her breath that I couldn't hear. When it came to strong-headed opinions, Eliza, my mother, and my grandfather were evenly matched. She untied her apron and hung it from the hook. Where are you going? I asked. Grandfather and I could run any errand you need. Not this errand, you couldn't. Eliza reached from her pretty straw hat. The Free African Society is having a meeting about the fever. It should prove a lively gathering. I'll return in time for supper. Okay, so the Free African Society is... Remember, this is 1793. And slavery is absolutely legal in most of the United States. Philadelphia had slaves in it. It wasn't like the South, where you were absolutely going to be a slave if you were of African descent. But it absolutely was a thing. And the Free African Society is a group of people that work together for freed slaves mostly, and to help them out. And remember that Eliza is a former slave herself, and so she is very active in this. Now, in real life, in Philadelphia, the Free African Society during this time was a thing, and it did meet, and it did try to help people out through this. And as we get further into the book, they'll become more prominent. And the things that they did there are pretty dang historically accurate as far as I can tell. This is people looking after each other. Also, just like today, there is a wealth gap with people, and people who are less wealthy tend to have harder times in epidemics and these things, less access to healthcare, less access to each other. to other things, and this was no different then. And if you were a freed slave or a slave, you were not probably very well off, and so that became a thing. That was an issue. Andrew, okay, out the back door, the necessary slam. Matty Cook, called grandfather. Must I wait all day? Andrew Brown's print shop smelled of ink and grease and the sweat of muscular apprentices. So, this is 1793. They don't have the internet, they have printing presses. And so the way that a printing press works, I don't know if you've ever seen one, but old school printing presses kind of worked like this. You had a base, and you had a whole bunch of like little markers that had letters on them. So there were like an S and an E, and you put them in order on like a grid type thing. And you had to do this one letter at a time, and you wrote out the things. And you made like basically a giant stamp. And then this would come over and you put a piece of paper underneath it, and you'd go over there and you'd stamp on it. So, and it's heavy. These things were generally oftentimes made out of, often they were made out of wood, but sometimes they were made out of metal. Metal would hold up better. Wood would eventually warp and crack. And so these things get really, really heavy. And it was a job. It was hard. It was a hard thing to do. And carrying trays of lead type from the composing tables to the printing press. So these ones that they're talking of would have been made of lead. When I was a child, Mr. Brown let me pick out letters and set them in the form. It had been a thrill seeing my words in print. The printer issued no invitation to me that morning. He was deep in conversation with Mr. Karras as we entered. What news, William? Mr. Brown asked. Pack your bags for a trip to the country? He wiped his hands on his apron and set an apprentice for a bucket of ale. Grandfather banged his cane on the floor. I didn't run from the redcoats, and I won't run from a dockside miasma. What is wrong with people, Andrew? So he fought in the War of Independences, the redcoats. You probably remember that. Sorry, excuse me. He suffered all kinds of disease. We suffered all kinds of disease in our youth, but folks were sensible. They didn't squall like children and hide in the woods. People aren't as tough as they used to be. Mr. Harris cleared his throat. If the yellow fever were a soldier, you'd run it through with your famous sword and sit down to a hearty dinner. But there may be cause for caution, old friend. Listen to the mayor's orders, which Andrew had just printed. He picked up a broadsheet and read. So, for me, some of what made this real is when, like, there were stay-at-home orders and directions for how to stay safe. And we started getting these things. I mean, we deal with... My first thought is, okay, it's a sickness. We get flu. This happens. And then as it became more real and you see these things and people who... there's a church right down my street and they closed. And you see people acting in a way that they normally wouldn't. And for me, that's one of the moments when it started to become real. And this reminds me of kind of the thing that came out. So I started watching the news religiously, Dr. Fauci, and be like, okay, what do we do here? What things should I follow? So number one, all persons should avoid those that are infected. Yes, social distancing was a thing in 1793. The homes of the sick should be marked. Now, that is a thing that we haven't done, but it is a thing that they would do in the past, and that would be so you could avoid the people who are sick. We've talked a little bit in like, if you've had this or you have the antibodies and you are possibly immune, of somehow opening it up to people who are immune because you wouldn't be able to spread or to get it. Sick people should be placed in the center of large, airy rooms without curtains and should be kept clean. So they're trying to figure out how to treat it. We must supply a hospital for the poor. Oh my gosh, how much have we talked about hospitals, making sure that people have health care? How many things have I watched about ventilators and not having enough PPE? All bell tolling should cease immediately. The dead should be buried privately. This is another thing that's happened a little bit with COVID, is the way that we have done funerals is different right now because they're generally really big meetings and we can't do that. And they're trying to do the same thing. They were trying the same things that we are trying right now are some of the things that they tried in 1793. The streets and wharves must be kept clean. All persons should avoid fatigue of the body and mind. So this was the don't get yourself tired for no reason. All persons should avoid being in the sun, drafts, and evening air. Stay inside. Now, we kind of have different things. All persons should dress appropriately for the weather. So it was a really hot summer that summer. And this is also, in Philadelphia, there's a lot of water. And this was a thing that was carried by mosquitoes. Hot, humid water carries mosquitoes, and that's one of the reasons it went out. And all persons should consume alcohol in moderation. I'm glad they'll stop ringing the bells, I said. Sensible advice, mostly, Grandfather said. Still, I don't understand why so many run scared. They've taken over Ricketts Circus building on 12th Street to house the poor, said Mr. Brown. Isn't that why we have an almshouse? Asked Grandfather. The almshouse. An almshouse would be like a homeless shelter today. The almshouse is closed. They want to protect their residents from the disease, so the fever victims lie on the floor of Ricketts with little water and no care. Once a day they remove the bodies for burial. Ooh. A neighbor threatened to burn the place down if the sick were not removed, explained Mr. Karras. But where will they go? Asked Grandfather. No one knows. So you see this, like people trying to help other people and people being scared. We see the same thing here. Like, what do you do with cruise ships? How many have died, Mr. Karras, I asked. He turned to Miss Brown. How many dead, Andrew? Mr. Brown shrugged. It's hard to say with certainty. Another grim reality that we are dealing with. I've heard several hundred at least. Now, keep in mind that Philadelphia in 1793 has a much smaller population than us right now. So any numbers that we would get are going to be weird. But it's a city in a small area, so there's going to be anything from this is going to be a fairly large per capita number. I've heard several hundred at least, said Mr. Karras. Grandfather paused. Even a few hundred isn't enough to call it an epidemic, he said. Those are also words that I heard come out of people's mouths. Like, that's what Tom Brady said. Some doctors warn we may see several thousand dead before it's over. And then you started reading those things. Because, like, sicknesses happen all the time, right? So why are we making this huge deal out of this one? Well, it's different. There are 40,000 people living in Philadelphia. 40,000. So that's smaller than Ogden. But it's also 1793. Can you imagine if 1 in 40 were to die? To put that in terms, we live in America where there are 330-ish million people. For 1 in 40 people to die, it would need to be 9 million? 8 million? 8 million people. 8 million people would be the equivalent if 1,000 people died from this one. That's a lot. I don't believe... the room quieted as we pondered the number. I don't believe it, said Grandfather finally. People exaggerate. What about news from our friend Evans? Mr. Brown looked up. His wife is ill, and he has closed his shop. My business dwindles daily. I've already lost one of my lads, gone with his family to Willington. Which means that one of his sons went to a different place to get out of the city. Mrs. Ogilvy said that everyone of fashion has fled to their country estates, I offered. I heard one of her daughters was stricken, said Mr. Brown. Myself, I straddle a fence. One foot here stays in Philadelphia, the other foot is in the country. We know the air there is pure and the people safer. I say safer, mind not safe. There are reports of fever in Bucks County and Delaware. What of the governor, then? Grandfather said. Jefferson still comes into town, that's Thomas Jefferson, every morning, though everyone says he'll soon quit and retire to his farm at Monticello, said Mr. Karras. Bah! We don't need Jefferson. We have the general. President Washington won't abandon us. George Washington was the president at this time because this is right at the beginning of the country. Mr. Karras blew his nose loudly. The president retires to Virginia for a respite every September. He is not a man to change his habits. Even if he called the Congress back, few would dare return. Once again, same types of things that we're seeing today. I tell you, William, men who stood unafraid before British cannon run in fear of this foul pestilence. I fear for Philadelphia. I fear for the people. I fear for myself. Grandfather did not say a word as we walked home. I silently counted on my fingers 28 days until the end of September, and then on into October until the first frost. Frost always killed fever. Now, this is a thing that would have been true. Yellow fever is spread by mosquitoes. And so they're looking forward to a day when it gets cold. As far as we know, heat doesn't affect COVID, but those were things that were rumors that were going on at first, that, once it gets warm, because it's a lot of diseases do better in cold than they do in warm, and that's for various reasons. Sometimes it's because we're more indoors, and sometimes they've survived better in a different setting. COVID tends to not seem to be susceptible to heat, but they're looking for this. But for them, that would definitely work, because the first frost would kill off the mosquitoes. And if the mosquitoes die off, then the spread of yellow fever is going to diminish, because that's how yellow fever is spread. They don't really know this, but we know this. As far as frosts go, if you're in Utah, first frost is generally end September, early October. When I was when I did the farm, I ran a farm for a long time. I always kind of counted October 10th as the unofficial frost date. I don't know if that's true, but that's when I would expect tomatoes to die, because they'd get hit by frost, and once tomatoes get hit by frost, they're dead. So she's counting almost 2 months. Frost always killed fever. Mr. Karras said it drained the poison from the air. It kind of does. It kills the mosquitoes. The Luddingtons were sounding better. Slopping pigs couldn't be that much harder than serving in the front room, and it would be better than falling ill or dying. I'd be there over harvest. They would make me work in the fields and feed me bread and water, but I wouldn't get sick. Grandfather stayed silent until we were approached a limping man dressed in dark rags, pushing a cart. Wonder where that fellow's going, he said. Looks like he belongs on the waterfront. A thin white arm flopped over the side of the cart as it jostled over the cobblestones. So what is he carrying in the cart? Hello there, good man, called Grandfather. There's no place for the dead up here. Hello! He's carrying a cart full of corpses, because they have to get rid of them. The man ignored us and pressed on steadily. Perhaps he is transporting a poor woman to work at the circus like Mr. Karras said, I suggested. She should be moved at night, when good people are safe in their beds. Now what is he doing? The man stopped at the corner of High and 7th in front of our coffee house. Grandfather sped up. Sir, I protest most vehemently. I lifted my skirts and ran ahead of Grandfather. An unnamed fear shot through me. My eyes filled with tears. No, this is too much, Grandfather called angrily. Sir, he shouted, take that away from my home. Now, off with you now. Take your cargo, or I shall call the constable. Constable's like the chief of police. The man turned back and looked at Grandfather, and then lifted the handles of the wheelbarrow and dumped the woman on the street. Mother! I screamed. So it's Maddie's mom who was in the cart. She's not. Is she okay? That's where I'm going to end. I'm at about 26 minutes on this. It's a longer chapter, but I wanted to go through that one because there were so many connections and so many things that were similar to about a month ago when we first started dealing with things and the rules for social distancing came out. And I kind of wanted you to see that even back in the day, they had done these things. And also that, yeah, this happened. And yeah, this is happening. But Philadelphia survived it. It was a crappy couple months. And it was hard. But they survived it. And this was back in 1793. And they didn't have as much good information as we do now. And so we will make it through this. It's going to be hard. It has been hard. But we'll make it through this. And we'll be okay. It's going to take a while, but we'll get there. I mean, if they could do it in 1793, we can do it in 2020. I mean, we have magical boxes that shoot rays of information at you, and I can talk to you from the past on your TV screen, which is made up of electrons going through plasma or liquid crystals. It's kind of like magic. Being in the future is like being a wizard. Anyway, that's where we're going to end off today. Your readings to get through chapter 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This was chapter 8. Remember, I'm going to ask you to provide a summary. So just think of 1 or 2 sentences to sum up each chapter and make some connections. Tons of connections that you can make. This chapter in particular, very, 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 like, I read it through this and I was like, oh my gosh, it's like I'm reading the newspaper today. And then there will be the questions section. Make sure you get all those things done. And if you have any questions, you want to talk about the book, we've always got the Google Meets. I will see you guys later. I hope you have a good weekend. Although, if you're my B-Day, you're probably watching this on Monday, so I hope you had a good weekend. And miss you guys. See ya.
Science Yoshi in the lab doing science, trying to cure HPV. I know it sounds quite magical, at least it does to me. Inject the bacteria into a plant to create a plant-based vaccine. I'd love to explain how it works, my friend, but I lack the knowledge you need. Listen, I just know that they work and that vaccines are a good thing, okay? Alright, Carl Sagan 42 says, the more you know.